The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everybody and welcome to this IIBA UK webinar. So I want to make you aware this session is recorded and will be made available at a later time. My name is Sam Merrick and I'm the IIBA UK's Corporate Relationship Director. So I'll be your host for this webinar. This session is called User-Centered Design, Solutions that Walk the Walk, as you should be able to see on the screen. And shortly I'll hand you over to our presenter tonight, Nick Voil, who is the author of, as you can see the book on there, User Experience Foundations, which was released last week by the BCS, although I have it in good faith that Nick hasn't yet got a copy. So Nick was a director at IIBA UK for 8 years. He is a consultant, a trainer, and he helps organisations design from the outside in. Following Nick's presentation, there'll be time for questions at the end. But of course, you can raise any questions that you've got throughout the webinar by using the chat function. Nick might see that and might address the question throughout the presentation. But if not, then we can ask Nick at the end. So I'll hand you over to Nick.
Thank you very much, Sam. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for inviting me, Sam. It's great to be back with IIBA UK. Seems like a lifetime since I stepped down from the board, even though it was only 3 months ago. And you're all doing a great job. So I know that a couple of the people that registered for this session have ordered the book. I know that at least one of them ordered it on Kindle, so you're probably ahead of the rest of us in that you've probably actually seen the book. I hope you're enjoying it. It's the official textbook for the BCS Foundation Certificate in User Experience, which is a certification that I run training for. And I'm very hopeful that it's going to become included as one of the foundation certificates you're allowed to count as one of your modules for the BCS International Diploma in Business Analysis, although I don't know if that's going to happen, and if so, when it's going to happen, but I hope it will. So some of the things we'll be talking about in this session are in the book. Obviously, we're not going to cover everything that's in the book, but also I've included quite a lot that isn't in the book to give you some extra material. So let's look at some of the things that you might have in mind when you're thinking about, as a business analyst, when you're thinking about user experience. I've put together this thing that I've called a value ladder for business analysts, user experience value ladder. So it's one of these classic maturity model type ladders, if I can put it that way. You might be at level 1 there on the left, where you're not really aware of user experience, although it's rather unlikely since you're on this call. But some BAs are not really aware of user experience, or they're not bothered about it. They think it's someone else's problem. You might want to find out a bit more about user experience so that you can understand your colleagues better. If you've got user experience people, user interface design people, maybe user researchers, interaction designers, etc. You might just want to know what they're on about. What are these activities they're engaging in? So that's sort of level 2 there. Level 3 is you might actually want to use some user experience techniques in your work. A lot of BAs now are aware of techniques like personas, journey maps, and so on. There is always a danger that when people use techniques like personas, they're using them in what I've heard referred to as a cargo cult user experience way. In other words, people are using the format of the documentation, but they're not necessarily understanding how it fits into the big picture or doing it in the right way. But nevertheless, these are really, really powerful techniques. Journey mapping in particular, I think, is incredibly useful. You might want to go to level 4, where you've got an integrated view in your team of how to do business analysis, how to do user experience work, and how those things should fit together. But what I'd really like you to get to is level 5 on the right there, where you're using an evidence-based user-centered design approach, which leverages all the strengths of both the skill sets. And that's really what I'm going to aim to talk about in this session, an evidence-based user-centered design approach. It's worth, in my opinion, it's worth doing the certificate, the BCS Foundation certificate, whichever of these levels you're interested in getting to. It will, you know, it's a really useful addition to your toolkit, in my opinion. I think there's a danger for business analysts, and there's an opportunity for business analysts here. The danger is that other people, other roles, are going to walk off with a lot of the interesting bits of the work that business analysts could be doing, because business analysts are too ingrained into a narrow view of what a business analyst does. Some people believe that business analysts do requirements catalogs, they do business process modeling, and that's about it, really. Of course, that's not right, or certainly that's not what I believe. But some of the things that we'll be talking about in this session are actually associated, you know, obviously they're more often associated with user experience specialists, but also a lot of what we're going to be talking about, some people will count as product management. Product management, you know, is an increasingly visible discipline, and the product owner role as well as the product manager role. But I think that you know, I don't care what your job title is. To me, it's all about designing systems, designing products, designing services, and designing things that work for people. Basically, that's what we do, and that's why I put this on the next slide. You are a designer. If you're a business analyst, to my way of thinking, you're a designer. You don't have to be a software designer, you don't have to be a user interface designer, but if you are deciding on, or you're recommending changes to the way that a business works, then you are designing those things. You're designing them for a reason. You're coming up with integrated sets of changes to the way that things are done. That's design. So what do we need to know about systems if we are in fact designing systems? This is a quotation from quite an old book now. It's some of the things in this book, Systemantics, are a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but it's full of a lot of wisdom about systems. And I believe this to be true. A complex system that works is invariably found to have evolved from a simple system that worked. And the corollary of that, if you like, is that a complex system designed from scratch never works and can't be patched up to make it work. You have to start over with a working, simple system. Now, this is not to say that the systems we design aren't complex. Of course, some of the systems we get involved with are very complex. But the best way of designing those things, in my opinion, is to start small, make sure you're on the right path, and then work iteratively to make sure that every decision you make along that path is in touch with the real world. So an iterative way of doing things, I very strongly believe, is the way to go. I want to show you a little movie clip about how systems develop to a detailed level. I hope the movie clip is going to be cooperative and work. It's about tomatoes. So I'm not sure if my friend Nick is on the call, but we were talking about tomatoes earlier. You know, during the lockdown, I've been trying to grow tomato plants. It hasn't been the best year for tomatoes, but they're getting on okay. So let me see if this works. Watch carefully. So as you can see, it's a time-lapse film. We've got 3 tomato plants, and they're going through a series of transformations. But each transformation is quite a simple transformation. They're being watered, getting bigger, they're getting more complex. And we're not going to see the entire life cycle of the tomato plant. We're not going to see the actual tomatoes growing, but we've seen some quite interesting things there. Some of the things that strike me about that movie. Firstly, you know, a tomato plant, even a little tomato plant like this without any fruit on it, is complex. It's a complex system. And you can't bring that system into being by designing it all in one go. You can't specify all the details of what the system is going to be like right up front. That's not how it happens. You have to go through the process. So bringing it into being is a process, and you can't avoid going through that process. Another thing, as I mentioned earlier, the development that it goes through at each stage is quite simple. You'll have seen that when it first germinated and came out of the ground, it just had 2 leaves. All 3 plants just had 2 leaves, and then they gradually grew in a certain way. They went through a fairly predictable sequence of steps, but you can't predict the exact shape of the final system. The exact shape of the final system it shapes itself according to its environment. So each of these 3 plants has shaped itself partly in a way that's influenced by the fact there are 2 other plants in the same pot. And most interestingly, I think, at each stage of its development, each plant is interacting with the environment. So it's getting feedback from the environment. You saw how, as the plant was watered, it perked up. Each time it was watered, it perked up and it put on a growth spurt. And then while it was waiting to be watered again, it started to droop a bit. And the plant has to go through these stages. It's that process of going through that interaction with the environment is part of the process that you have to go through if you want to get the final plant. So it's getting that input from the environment. And if we think of the types of systems that we work with as business analysts, what's the an analogous thing to that? Well, it's the feedback that you get if you use an iterative approach to designing and implementing systems. The feedback that you get from working with the end users of the system and getting them to use the system. That's really the key thing with a user-centered design approach. So one of the people I like to quote is this guy, Christopher Alexander. So I'm interested in architecture. I don't mean business architecture, solutions architecture, enterprise architecture. I mean buildings, the built environment. And he's one of the most influential architects of the last 100 years. He's still around. His first influential book was written in the 1960s. And he's an amazing guy. And he talks about, he's very interested in complexity and reconciling different stakeholders' needs from a system. So you can see why I'm so interested in his work. And he talks about unfolding, just like we saw the tomato plants unfold. He talks about 4 necessary conditions for unfolding in the human-made world. The first one is step-by-step adaptation. So he's got buildings in mind, but all of this is completely applicable to what we do. Step-by-step adaptation. So with each iteration, each sprint, if you want to call it that, each adaptation is about a good fit, having things fitted closely to a harmonious whole. You do that at every step of the way. You make sure that there is that harmony with the environment, with the context at every step of the way. Feedback, as I was just saying, continuous, immediate feedback about whether what's been done is what he calls a living structure. In human society, this requires a shared understanding of what life is all about. And in my opinion, you know, for business systems or business to consumer systems, life is about usable, useful systems. Unpredictability. Unfolding cannot occur except in a framework which allows the whole to go where it must go. And I love this next sentence. The dire modern passion for planning and advanced control must be replaced by an attitude which recognizes that openness to the future and lack of predictability is a condition for success. Now, that's, to a lot of business analysts, that's a strange thing to say, because we like to feel that we have control. But I think that we need to let go a bit. We need to let things go their own way over the course of a project and an innovation, a business change. And then finally, as he says, the most difficult thing for us is awareness of the whole. There needs to be this awareness of the whole system throughout the process. I really believe that's incredibly important. And that's one of the reasons why some of the things we do as business analysts aren't perfectly suited to this kind of iterative, evolutionary project. So here's another quotation from a different book by Christopher Alexander. This is his first one, and this is one that I quote in the book. When we speak of design, what we're really talking about is not the form alone, so not the shape of the thing we're creating on its own, but also the ensemble which consists of that form and the context that it's in. So this is absolutely crucial. We need to take into account the context of use. This idea of the context of use is absolutely fundamental in user-centered design. So user-centered design is what the book is really about. It's based on the international standard which describes user-centered design, ISO 9241-210. And these are the principles of user-centered design. So the design is based on an explicit understanding of the users, of the tasks that they're trying to achieve, and the environments that they're in. And that means physical environments, technical environments, so what are the tools they're trying to use, and social environments, so who are the people that they're with, who are the people that they are engaged in some kind of interaction with or joint activity with. Secondly, the users are involved throughout the design and development, absolutely crucial. And not just involved, I mean really involved. The design is driven and refined by user-centered evaluation. We'll say some more about that in a minute. The process is iterative. The design addresses the whole user experience, and there's lots about that in the book. We don't have time to go through all that in this session. And the design team includes multidisciplinary skills and perspectives. So, I just said I don't care what your job title is, but obviously you need to have a blend of skills and perspectives on the team. You need to have a diverse team in order to make good decisions. You need to have a whole range of skills. But putting the team together, you need to be thinking about the people and the skills that they've got, and not be thinking about their job titles, because that really isn't important. And the other key thing in that international standard, as well as those principles, is this cycle. So I've adapted this diagram very slightly from what's in the standard. It's got these 5 processes that are going on as part of your design cycle. They're going on simultaneously. So these arrows are not saying you do this, then you do that, then you do the other. There are 5 processes that you're doing simultaneously. So you are understanding the context, and understanding the context means the context of use of the system, and that means understanding the users. Understanding the users, as I just said, understanding the tasks that they're trying to achieve, the goals that they're aiming for, the problems that they have, the needs that they have, the things that are frustrating them, the things they would like to do, the tools that they're using, the problems that they're having using those tools, etc. So that's understanding the context. And the reason there's this little icon of a person there is that you cannot do that without directly studying those people. You've got to directly study those people. You can't just make it up. You can't just talk to your marketing department about your users. You've got to get out of the building and go and watch those people doing whatever it is that they're doing that's relevant to you. Or if they are, if it's a business internal system, well, then maybe you don't need to get out of the building. You need to go to the relevant parts of the building, assuming, of course, we are all ever back in buildings together. But of course, you can do it virtually. You can go to that where your users are virtually. Specify the requirements, so you use that understanding of the context to come up with some idea of what your system is going to do, and then you're going to make designs. Making designs could be anything. It could be a prototype of a user interface. It could be a journey map. It could be some kind of interactive system. It could be all sorts of things. They will be different as you go through the different iterations. And then the next absolutely crucial thing to do is to evaluate those designs. And again, that's got the little icon of the person. It's got the icon of the person because the only valid way of knowing whether what you've created is useful and usable is by giving it to one of your users and seeing if it's useful to them and seeing if they can use it. That's the only way of doing it. It sounds kind of obvious when I say it, and yet I wonder how many of us actually do that as a matter of course. So this is not a cycle we go through once on a project. It's not a cycle we go through twice. We need to go through it over and over again. And a way that I like to visualize it, this is another picture from the book, is as a spiral, or as I put it here, a helix. So we've got those 5 phases or 5 processes represented here, but we're looking at them sideways on, if you like. So we can see the time dimension all of a sudden. The time dimension is going from left to right here, and we can see that understanding the context of use, specifying the requirements, making designs, and evaluating the designs, they're all going round in a spiral. They're kind of dancing with each other, if you like, and they're going on forever. That's why they are fading away on the right-hand side. They're not coming to a neat stop, because in life, things don't come to a neat stop. And the planning activity, if I just go back to the previous slide, on this slide, we can see the plan, the work is sort of feeding in from the top as if it were a one-off pre-project activity. That's not the case at all, very far from it. It's actually the core that runs through the spiral, that runs through your whole project, because you're planning and replanning and replanning. Every time you go around an iteration, you're replanning. You're saying, what do we need to do next? What's the most important thing that we need to do next. There's a lot that's involved in this evaluating and planning, and that's what I've tried to show on the next slide. This is where our evidence-based user-centered design process is detailed a little bit more. So what's inside this circle is what we are trying to achieve. This is what our main objective should be on our project. It's not to create an artifact, not to create a system, but to acquire knowledge. Because, you know, building, for example, building software systems, I mean, not everything that we do is software systems, but sometimes it is. Software systems are quite easy to build these days, aren't they? You can knock up a software system quite fast. What you can't do so easily is get this knowledge and make sure that it's accurate knowledge about your users, about the environment that they're in, knowledge about the goals that they have, the tasks that they're trying to do to achieve those goals. What are the problems which you could see as opportunities? Opportunities for your project, for your product, if you're seeing it that way, for your service, and different types of solutions that you could create. So I think it's important to recognize that we don't just say, here are our users, now what problems have they got, now what solutions can we create for them? I mean, that is certainly conceptually, that's the right order to do it in. You need to start with your users and their goals, then you need to think about what problems they've got, then you need to develop solutions for them. But as you go through the overall iterative process, you will refine your understanding of who your users are and what their goals are. And that will cause you to sort of rejig your ideas about what the problems they have are, and what the opportunities are for you to make things better. And of course, that will influence the solutions that you come up with. So those things are all bound together. They're all interrelated. It's covered in a certain amount of depth in the book, but there's other stuff as well. So when we think about the users and their goals and what our solution might do for them, another thing we need to think of is what would be a visible outcome. So what is the evidence that we might look for to show that the solution we've built really solves their problem? So we might come up with an idea for a solution. We think we think there's a bunch of users that are like this. We think they've got this problem, and we think that if we create this type of solution with this feature, it will solve their problem. Well, this box, the visible outcome box, is saying, what would be the proof? What would be the proof that we would look for that we were right? And when we've defined a visible outcome, then we can design an experiment. We can design an experiment, or we can put together a hypothesis. Everything we're describing on this slide is a hypothesis, really. We can design an experiment to test that hypothesis. And then we will do the experiment. And what's the experiment going to be? Well, some of the things that I talk about in the book are things like paper prototyping and usability testing. Those are techniques that are very much associated with user interface design and a general usability work that's often associated with user interfaces, but they don't have to be about user interfaces. You can do this experiment design with any kind of product or service. There are different sorts of experiment that you can do, as well as paper prototyping, as well as usability testing. And a lot of people thinking about methodology this way are coming up with ideas about this now. I mean, there's one great book that I read recently called Testing Business Ideas, which you might have seen. It's one of the authors is Alex Osterwalder, who wrote Business Model Generation and the Value Proposition Design book, and it's just as good as those ones. There's lots of ideas in there for different types of experiment that you can do. And then when you do your experiment, as part of the design of the experiment, you will say, well, what do we expect to see? How will we know that we've proved our hypothesis is right? So you will, as part of the design of the experiment, you'll have said that, and then when you do the experiment, you will make observations. You'll see things. Some of them might be that you will see that the thing you expected, yes, it does happen, or sometimes you will see, oh, no, it doesn't happen. Or you might see some other things that aren't directly related to the thing you were expecting to see, but it's useful information nevertheless. So that's all grist to your mill. You can record all that, and then you will learn from that. You will learn stuff about your users that you didn't know, stuff about their tasks, their goals, their motivations that you didn't know, stuff about their context, their problems, etc. that you didn't know. And therefore, you'll be able to draw conclusions about solutions that would be more useful than the one you've just experimented with. The next thing I would suggest you need to do, or you need to do this at somewhere in the process, is you need to filter this through a set of questions you want to ask about, well, what is the type of solution that we actually want to create? Now here I'm thinking about the whole business of unintended consequences. Very often we find people design technology-driven solutions which sound clever, or maybe they make the inventor of them a lot of money, but there's something undesirable about them from a social point of view, from an ethical point of view, whatever it might be. So we need some kind of filtering mechanism in there, or maybe it's just financial filtering. Some things cost too much to do, or they don't fit in with the way we want our business to go. And when we've got our learning and we've filtered it, then we can make some decisions, and the decisions are, okay, in our next iteration, we're going to do something different. This is what we're going to do. So this evidence-based user-centered design process, I think, is the way that people are going with projects. Now, as business analysts, a lot of us have been trained to use other types of thinking, other types of tool. Here's one. On the left, you can see it lurking there on the left-hand side. That's a real screenshot of a real requirements catalog. I had to shrink it down very small to try and get as much of it as possible in. I'm not a big fan of requirements catalogs. Of course, they serve a useful purpose, but they don't really support this very well. And they don't support Christopher Alexander's principles very well, and they don't support that evidence-based user-centered design process very well. The document has got no shape to it. It's just a list. It's just inert. You can't deduce anything from it. If you've ever been in a requirements review meeting where people have tried to review a whole spreadsheet full of requirements, or a printout from Jira or whatever it might be, you will know the feeling when you get 3/4 of the way through the list. No one's got any interest anymore. So there's no dynamism to it. It's just a list. There's normally far too much detail in there to allow you to look at it and say, yes, I get it, I understand what's going on here. But on the other hand, sometimes there's too little detail for it to be genuinely rigorous. So sometimes it falls between those two stools. And the structure of the document does not reflect the shape of the problem, and it doesn't reflect the shape of the solution either, which I think is a problem. Because we want to take an iterative approach, we want to be able to change our design very, very fast. So we want minimalist tools, which obviously I'm thinking of visual models, and of course user stories are very useful for that as well. They're boring, requirements catalogs are boring. I defy anyone to find them interesting. They're most useful if you keep them to the high-level business requirements. So if you can keep it to the genuine business requirements, that's good. But very often I see in requirements catalogs there's a whole load of functional requirements in there, details about the way that the solution should work. That's not such a good idea, in my opinion, to put in a requirements catalog. And when I say business requirements, I mean things that people need. That are independent of the solution. I'm not talking about business requirements in the sense of so-called general and technical requirements as categorized in the BCS syllabus. My belief is that categorizing requirements is at best a waste of time. You can spend a whole lifetime, it feels like, trying to say, well, is this a technical requirement? Is it a non-functional requirement? And when I was looking through some of what Christopher Alexander had read to prepare these slides, one thing really jumped out at me, something that he said, the principal features of a complex configuration are always created by overlap. When we examine the overall design, you'll see that this kind of overlap and ambiguity is essential and pervasive. This is the glue in any system of wholes. Wholeness itself is directly created by this apparent overlap or ambiguity. Now, of course, we don't have time to go into Christopher Alexander's whole system of thought to do with architecture. But the use of those words overlap and ambiguity really jumped out at me as someone that's been paying a lot of attention to requirements engineering recently. We're all taught to avoid overlapping requirements, avoid ambiguous requirements, and yet here is this guy saying we need overlap and we need ambiguity. So that's interesting, if nothing else. I'm just going to leave that there. I'm just going to put that out there. Then coming on to how do we do this iterative design? Here's the Design Council's famous double diamond. I'm sure a lot of you have seen this, where they define a project into 4 phases. You're given the brief at the beginning, then you use divergent thinking in a discovery phase, then you use convergent thinking in a definition phase. You converge on having explored the problem area in that first stage, you then converge on a clear problem statement in the middle there, and then you go into another phase of divergent thinking where you develop some ideas for a solution and then you deliver one, and that's it. That's the double diamond. And a lot of people have talked a lot about this. Is it good? Is it bad? Some people love it. Some people think it's inadequate. I think the obvious thing when we go back to what I was just saying about the helix and iterating and iterating and iterating is that it's not enough. We need lots of double diamonds. So my preferred idea is what I like to call an Aran sweater. Aran sweaters are those cable knit jumpers that have got lots and lots and lots of diamonds on them. So if we're going from left to right, this is the sort of thing that I would expect to see on an innovation project. I'd expect to see lots and lots of convergent, divergent, convergent, divergent thought. As all these hypotheses are generated, then you test the hypotheses. You discard some hypotheses, you refine your hypotheses. Because remember, going back to what I was saying at the beginning, our aim is to get knowledge. It's not necessarily to build something straight away, because that's the easy bit, and we need to not jump into that. We need to develop the knowledge. And that brings me on to the last point that I wanted to make, which is agile. Now, the funny thing about agile is that it's iterative. It's all about developing knowledge. So it ought to be an absolutely perfect fit for user-centered design. It ought to be that we can get user-centered designers, business analysts, and agile developers all together into a team and we can use this process that I've been describing. But it doesn't work like that. And the reason it doesn't work like that is this sentence that I've highlighted in yellow, where it says, this is from the Scrum Guide. The heart of Scrum is a sprint. It's a time box of 1 month or less during which a done, usable, and potentially releasable product increment is created. In other words, you've got to start cranking out working code right from the beginning. And there's lots of good things about that idea, the idea of cranking out useful code from the beginning of a project sometimes. But in the types of projects that I've been talking about, it's a disastrous idea because it forces you to close down options far too early. You want to leave your options open. You want to define things as vaguely as possible. You want to defer commitments, as they say. You don't want any premature decisions, because every decision that you make has within it, to come back to the horticultural metaphor or agricultural, each decision has within it the seed of its own failure, because each decision is, once you start building something, it will take you down a certain route, and one day that will turn out to be the wrong route, whether it's straight away or later on. So you know, I think for a lot of projects, this insistence on cranking out code right from the beginning is really catastrophic. And I'm not sure if it's really what the inventors of Scrum or the inventors of Agile in general really had in mind. I think you can think about product and product increment in a different way. You can say, well, in the later stages of our project, then yes, when we say a done increment of product, yes, we mean working software. But you know what? In the first half of our project, that's not what we mean. The product that we're creating is actually our understanding of our users and our understanding of all those other things, the problems, the solutions, the context, etc., etc. And I look forward to that becoming a more widely accepted as a way of interpreting what Agile is all about. But for the moment, I think we've got a lot of work to do to get that across. Here's a few references for some of the people I mentioned earlier. A lot of people are sort of converging on these ideas. So, in the second row there, Gojko Ajic, his book about impact mapping, that was quite a few years ago now. You've got Jeff Gotthelf and Josh Seiden wrote the Lean UX Canvas a few years ago. That's a really, really useful tool. Teresa Torres and John Cutler, both incredibly interesting people to follow on Twitter if you don't already. I mentioned Testing Business Ideas, the Lean Enterprise and Lean Startup, two more very, very good books explaining this idea of hypotheses, how to base what you're doing around hypotheses. The user research knowledge Kanban there, that's a blog post from GDS that I came across, which shows how to, one way of displaying this knowledge on a Kanban board. And then of course there's jobs to be done. I've tried to avoid giving too much of a precise reference about jobs to be done, because those of you who have followed anything about that will know that it's incredibly controversial, and so I'm going to try to say as little as possible about that. So that's my slides for this session. I'm very much looking forward to hearing your thoughts and your comments. So over to you, Sam, to pass some thoughts and comments on to me.
Thanks, Nick. So I think that was absolutely fantastic presentation, very insightful. I know I, for one, I'm just starting a new piece of work, and I can see how I can use some of those user-centered design thoughts, I guess, in that. So we've had a few questions come through. Aside from a fun comment from James Shields about Argyle socks, there's been a couple of good questions. So first question then, Nick. In your opinion, what's the difference between a user researcher and a BA? That's from Rushma
Oh,
Pacha.
well, yeah, yeah, great question. So I know what a user researcher is. A user researcher is someone who tries to gain that knowledge of the users that I was talking about earlier. That's very clear. It's their job to 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 gain that deep, detailed, rich, vivid understanding of what it's like being one of the users. People sometimes use this word empathy, which is again open to misinterpretation, but to really understand everything about the users and then to pass that on to the rest of the team. I think those are the key, the key jobs of the user researcher. What a business analyst is, well, I ought to know, I suppose. But it's someone who looks at situations, who identifies options for solutions, who investigates those situations and those solutions. So to my way of thinking, user research is part of that. I like to think of myself as both a user researcher and a business analyst, but it is important to recognize that the traditional way of doing requirement solicitation as a business analyst is a bit different from user research, because as business analysts, when we're doing requirement solicitation, we've normally got a solution in mind. We normally want to get to the bottom of things, resolve all the issues, and get things moving forward in a particular way to meet the business's objectives. So we are rooting for the business really as business analysts, whereas as user researchers, we're rooting for the user. Now, of course, those things, it's an oversimplification to say that those things are in opposition to each other or even in contradistinction to each other, because very often what's good for the user is good for the business. But there's a difference of emphasis. So I see them as being on a spectrum, or part of the one overall thing. I think maybe in 50 years' time there won't be a job called business analyst. There won't be a job called user researcher. There'll be something else which incorporates both of them, I hope. I mean, the thing that worries me is that we see this increasing fragmentation of job roles. And what that results in is people talking, people in each job role talking their own language and using a particular terminology, having a particular mindset and a particular cultural sort of discourse that goes on, if you like, a vocabulary that they use, a way of thinking that they use, maybe a particular educational background that they've got, and that makes it hard for people to realize that, what, we're actually all trying to do the same thing. So yeah, simple question, excellent question, long answer, sorry.
No, thanks, Nick. So another question came in from, I hope I'm pronouncing this right, apologies if not, Anthony Acoli, and he's wondering whether your book teaches how to design, experiment and filter.
It certainly talks about design, and it talks about experiments as well. So design in the sense of laying out user interfaces, design in the sense of prototyping user interfaces, design in the sense of doing information architecture, which I haven't really mentioned. So that's about making it possible to find stuff or get access to functionality. So it certainly goes into detail about that. The filtering part, not so much. Not so much, no, because that's not really emphasized in the syllabus for the exam, and the book is very much written around the syllabus for the Foundation Certificate in User Experience. So I hope to develop those ideas a bit further elsewhere later on.
Thanks, Nick. I've got a couple more questions here. Just go to it. So, okay, so I'll read the whole question and comment out for you. So it says, brilliant stuff from Nick. Agree 100% there are challenges. People's first reaction to something is not always what they think after they've been using it for a while. People may like an increment, but then find the whole thing is problematic. What would you do when trying to replace an existing legacy system, and any ideas how to deal with these kinds of challenges?
What do you do when replacing a legacy system? Well,
Yeah, where the thing they think is what they've been using for a while.
yeah. I mean, I think it's really, really important to understand, the as-is situation, and I think that's a very important part of what's so good about the training that business analysts get. If you're an experienced, trained business analyst, you know an awful lot about how to understand an as-is situation, and you need to put those, those hard yards in. Obviously, we want to avoid getting carried away with some senior stakeholders' suggestion for a new system. We have to look at the idea. We have to work out what the requirements are, and we need to understand how the users are using that legacy system. And you can't take a shortcut. There's far too much. I mean, I've seen this many times. Organizations throw out the baby with the bathwater. They think, oh, this old system we've got has got, such and such a defect, or such and such a problem. It's a bit out of date in such and such a way, or it's got a clunky interface, or it doesn't support this particular product line of ours, or it doesn't have this interface to this particular system. Therefore, we need a new system. And then a new system is built. People don't do sufficient user research to understand how people are using it. They don't do sufficient as-is modeling to understand how it's being used, and therefore, what you end up with is part of the situation is improved by having a new system, but part of it isn't. And it's this whole sort of lift and shift mentality that I think certainly Christopher Alexander would be very much against. He talks about, in architectural terms, he talks about large lump development, which I think is a lovely phrase. He's talking about, when a whole housing estate is built, or a whole urban development is built in one big lump. It's built in one big lump. People say, oh yes, this is great, and they dump it down there and they leave it and they never revisit it. And that's a recipe for failure and for dissatisfaction. And what he advocates instead is steady, incremental maintenance, improvement, and repair. And I think that's a great thing to do with in-house business systems as well. It's not as exciting as pulling out the system and putting a new one in, but often it's a good idea. That's just one thought I have on that subject.
Thanks, Nick. That question was from Richard Collins, by the way. I've got another question. In fact, there's a few coming through. One's from Harpal Lidder. So his question was, how can you gain more buy-in from senior stakeholders with the benefits attached to user-centered design thinking?
Well, I think user-centered design is really, it's a de-risking approach. Just like, a lot of things have been sold to management that way. Traditional project management, in the sort of Prince 2 sense, is supposed to de-risk your projects by making sure that you know exactly what products you're going to create and in what order, and therefore, all you've got to do is manage that process and it'll be fine. Agile is supposed to de-risk your projects, and indeed, if you do it the right way, it does. Business analysis is a tool for de-risking your projects, because you're thinking about what you're doing properly. But I think what's distinctive about user-centered design is that it really is, it's all about reality. That's why I called the presentation Solutions That Walk the Walk, because it's about acknowledging that if you're system or product or service, whatever it is, I mean system in the broadest possible sense, if that has been built by continuously over and over again getting real users to try and use it, then it's bound to end up being useful and usable. You know, unless you're completely incompetent, you can't go through iteration after iteration of doing that without coming to something useful and usable. So it is it's a de-risking tool, if you like, and of course also it's an opportunity finding tool. As you do that in-depth studying of the users and the context, you will come up with more good ideas, and you'll refine those ideas. If you're constantly refining the ideas over and over again, you will come, you know, if we're talking about a product that you're selling to people or a service that you're selling to people, you will, you know, the chances are good you will end up with something that will make you money. You know, there's this myth that Apple, for example, don't do usability testing. You know, they do insanely much usability testing. They iterate, they iterate, they iterate, they iterate, they iterate. And if you're building in-house systems, obviously it's got to make good business sense to make sure that the thing that you're putting on people's desks, so to speak, is actually going to meet their needs. You can try and do that by writing down all the needs at the beginning of the project, then building something that ticks all those boxes and then saying, here you are, okay, let's do some user acceptance testing now. But, you know, doesn't it make much better business sense to keep doing that throughout? And then you will know for sure, you know, it's in a way, it's quite boringly predictable that you will end up with the right result.
Thanks, Nick. I think there's one more question, because I think another question you've pretty much answered now around project sort of senior stakeholders. So this question is from my colleague actually, Sakiba Abbas. So do you have any tips for how user experience and business analysts should collaborate in an agile environment or in a project?
Well, yeah, we haven't got time to go into that in a lot of detail, but I mean, I think the first thing is sit down together right at the beginning of the project. You both need to be involved right at the beginning of the project. It's the user experience person's job to shape the project right from the beginning, and it's the business analyst's job to shape the project right from the beginning. So if you're both working from the same hymn sheet, so to speak, from the beginning, that will solve a lot of problems. And then you need to explicitly you know, talk to each other, work in the open, as they say, all the way through. You need to come to an explicit understanding of how you're going to work together, and just keep talking.
Thanks, Nick. I think we've probably got chances to just squeeze in one more question, which is from myself. So I'm an ex-architecture student, as you might remember. So the subject of Christopher Alexander quotes was quite good. So I guess my question is, where might you think ambiguity and overlap may be needed within user-centered design?
Wow. Well, I think oh, that's a really big question. But I think we put a bit too much premium on avoiding what's sometimes dismissed as gold plating. I think there's a bit too much insistence on traceability, where every single thing that's built has to have a very clear monetary cost benefit for it. I mean, obviously you need to be very careful about those things, but I think it's nice if you can design and create a system that's a little bit loose around the edges, a little bit baggy, you know, so that there is room for those competing perspectives, those different perspectives to work. So Christopher Alexander, for example, you know, example he talked about is in an open space. You might have a bench. It might be a bench that really looks like a bench with arms, and it's shaped especially for seating, you know, it follows the contours of someone's body, etc., and it's got a back and so on. Or you might just have a low cuboid object, which can be used for sitting on, but it can also be used for, you know, skateboarding on, sleeping on, or, you know, all sorts of other things that you can't necessarily predict. And I think maybe we can take that kind of approach with other systems as well.
That's great. Thanks, Nick, and thanks for answering all of those questions. So I think there's one thing I'd like to just do at the end of this session is just tell everybody on the webinar. Obviously, thank you very much for joining. I think it's been great, but also we've got a few upcoming events for IIBA UK that you may want to look out for. So this Friday, there's the BA Brown Bag at 1 o'clock, which is a regular lunchtime session. There's also then on Friday the 31st of July, there's 2 sessions, both at 12 noon. One is Lunch and Learn, Do I Need a Career Coach? And the other one, for those that have attended any of the BABOK or BA Box study groups, there's a focus group session there to provide your thoughts or ideas into how we can improve those sessions, or if you've never been to them, you know, just bring some ideas around how we can maybe change those sessions to deliver value to the UK BA community. So yeah, it just brings me to a close. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending, and thanks especially to Nick for presenting. I think it's been really insightful. So thank you very much.
My pleasure, Sam.
Okay, thanks everybody. Bye.